RM Sotheby's is the world's largest collector car auction house by total sales. They are the preeminent market maker of high-quality collector cars and collections, regardless of size or complexity. By working in partnership with the Sotheby's team and its network of 80 offices in 40 countries, RM Sotheby's has established the largest client network of any collector car auction house in the world. Join the RM Sotheby's family by connecting with one of their car specialists at rmsotheby's.com or contact me directly at gstanley@rmsotheby's.com. LLC TLC is here to save you money on all of your vehicle purchases. LLC TLC will permanently register your classic cars in Montana to avoid any annual renewal fees. As your registered agent, they will handle everything for you so you never have to step foot in Montana. And as a listener of this podcast, LLC TLC is offering 30% off your entire package. Simply go to llctlc.com/classic or mention this podcast when you contact LLC TLC directly. All right, welcome to the Collector Car Podcast. I'm thrilled to have a returning guest, Jay Gillotti. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. All right, so you've been on the podcast before with your incredible Golf 917 book.
There it is.
Yeah, so there's so many incredible books out there, and I'm a big fan of yours. And we're talking today about a new Porsche book. So before we get to that, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you've been up to lately?
Well, mostly working on the new book. I mean, the new book took about 4 years to complete. Was my pandemic project. Started in May of 2020, and it was just, took a lot longer than the first book because we're dealing with a 150-year span of, time and history. So there was a lot of material to go through. But I've still also been doing a few magazine articles here and there, and I do a lot of volunteer work with the Porsche Club, of course. So I guess my main focus has been the book, but there have been a couple other interesting volunteer projects that I've been working on the past couple of years as well.
Well, and let's mention the book offhand, since you spent 4 years of your life, obviously. It's Porsche Decades, just beautiful, incredible book. And what I absolutely love this book because, if you're not a Golf or a 917 fan, that's a little bit deep to get into right off of the bat. Whereas this
Yeah.
kind of gives us an incredible overview of the Porsche brand from day one, correct?
Yeah, that's what it was meant to do. My first book is like most Porsche books that come out now. They're very, very detailed, very in-depth. They typically cover very narrow slice of the history. Sometimes we have, entire books about a single car. And so I thought it was time for something more introductory, more general, that would appeal to a much wider audience. Hoping to bring people into the discussion about the history and maybe get them interested in going on and reading some of the more in-depth material from all the other great Porsche authors that are out there.
Yeah, and what I loved about this book is because it is extremely in depth, but from a broad, I don't know, it's in depth, but it's also very broad. You're right. I mean, it's
Yeah.
you call it decades because it's by the decade. So we start,
Hmm.
super early, 1875.
Yeah.
And so if you think about Porsche guys, typically they're like, well, I'm a 964 guy. I'm a 996 guy. I'm a 997. I'm a Boxer. I'm a Cayman guy, a 356 guy. Well, this
Hmm.
book bridges everybody together, right? It's one of those books where you could enjoy reading it, each decade at a time, and it
Hmm.
connects the dots between all the generations, all the iterations, correct?
Yeah, and that's what I was hoping to do, because we have people that are, expert in certain areas, certain time periods, certain car models, and so forth. So I thought it would be great, though, even for those people who are expert in a certain area, to have the introductory overview material for the other eras that maybe they are not expert in. So, for instance, we have guys that know literally everything about Porsche street cars. But maybe those same people haven't looked as much at Porsche's competition and racing history. Or we have people who know Porsche's history pretty well for the last 75 years, but maybe, haven't looked very much at pre-World War II and pre-World War I. Porsche history. So that's why I wanted to go all the way back to 1875 when Dr. Porsche was born, and then bring it in an introductory manner, just bring it right up all the way to the book ends with Mission X and Porsche's 75th anniversary last June. So that's basically the span of time that we're covering. And that first chapter just covers from 1875 to the end of World War One. And then chapter 2 is the 20s, chapter 3 is the 30s, chapter 4 is the 40s, and so on. We go right up through the decades in that fashion.
It's very much like how do you eat an elephant, right? You start with the tail, right? And what I love about this is even reading it can be intimidating, but not the way you broke it out. So, like you said, you have it by decade. Obviously,
Yeah,
you take a big chunk in the front there from 1875 through World War
right.
One. But what I also love is that at the beginning of each chapter, you have the one-page recap with a timeline of the most significant events. So, you know what?
Hmm.
If you're like someone who's like, you know what, I don't want to read the whole chapter, you got this one pager that tells you here's the important stuff that happened in that decade, and then
Yeah.
you can actually just read about what you kind of want to read about. But I'm sure
Hmm.
that will draw you into reading the entire chapter. And it's got
Yeah.
great pictures. I mean, it is just tremendously well done. And you said it took 4 years. What
Hmm.
did you find? Like, what was the biggest challenge of trying to eat this elephant?
Oh my God. Yeah, the biggest challenge, it was really agonizing sitting here at my desk trying to think of what to leave out.
Hmm.
Because Porsche's history is so long and so rich and so fascinating to me anyway, that going through the material and trying to think of, w- you know, what can I fit into a reasonably sized book for the newer people, new Porsche Club members, new Porsche owners, people who haven't looked at this history before, you know. And in that process, I did have to leave out tons of great stuff,
Sure.
and that was really tough. I tried to get creative though to sneak some of the good stuff, and instead of ending up completely on the cutting room floor, some of it ends up in my sidebars, which I love doing sidebars. And also we have our Porsche points, which are little fun facts and points of interest that I thought were too good to leave out, but didn't really fit the main narrative. So those are included in these little boxes called Porsche points. And so hopefully people will find those interesting, and breaks up the main narrative a little bit. If you want to take a break from the main narrative, you can look at the sidebars, look at the Porsche points, and each chapter is divided into subchapters. So I often tell people, read one subchapter at a time, and try to digest it, because even at an introductory level, there's a lot of information that we're covering here, over a 150-year period of time.
Yeah, very fascinating. Very cool. It's very much for the ADD generation, right? You can jump in at where you want. You don't necessarily have to eat the whole thing in
Yeah, I
one
know.
reading.
I think what a lot of people are going to do is the first thing they're going to do is they're going to look up their car. If they are a Porsche owner already, they're probably going to look up their car or cars and see what I had to say about their particular car, which is great. Hopefully they'll learn something. They'll learn how their car fits into the context of what came before, what came after, and so on. And yeah, it's a book you can pick up if there's a particular era that you're really interested in and you want to start with the 1980s, for instance. That's great. You can start with the 1980s, work forward, work backward. You can go any direction that you want, really. I'm a chronologic guy, so I think of things, in chronologic order. That's how the book was written. The book was written, right beginning to end, pretty much. And But that doesn't mean that's the only way to consume it. You can take it one bite at a time, and you can go in any order. You don't have to follow chronologically at all if you don't want to.
Yeah, so if you were a reader picking out the book for the first time, where
Yeah.
would you start? Do you have a Porsche in your garage that you would start with the 993 generation, or where would you start?
Well, we have two. I have a 1985 3.2 Carrera for my air cooled.
Mhm.
And for more modern Porsche, we have a 987 Cayman S. So I might be tempted to start with one or the other of those. But of course, as you know, Greg, I'm really passionate about Porsche's racing history,
Yeah.
particularly in sort of the golden age of sports car racing, the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. So if I that's also an era or a place in the book where I'd be looking. If it was somebody else's book, I'd probably be looking to hone in there as well, because that's the period of time that really speaks to me. Um, and I just, but again, I'm a chronologic guy, so I tend to want to go beginning to end, start at the beginning and see how each step follows logically the next step. And how did Porsche grow um, from not even being a company, or from being a design company to being a manufacturing company, and then building all these amazing cars over the past 75 years.
So, as you were writing the book, obviously you're probably not a fan of every generation. Maybe you are, but like what chapter, what era, what decade did you say, "Oh my gosh, I got to write about this, but I'm not thrilled about it." But then at the end of it, you were kind of like, "Oh, that was pretty cool. I learned some stuff I didn't know really much about."
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say the 1950s comes to mind because I've never been a huge 356 guy. Although I drove Volkswagen Beetles, in high school and college, like many of us did. But I've never had great affinity for the 356 and the cars of that period. But the more I read about it, the more interested I became. The more research I did, the more interesting I found it to be, because, of course, that period of time really creates a foundation from which
Right.
Porsche has continued on for these past many decades. And without all the foundational work of the 1950s, particularly, we wouldn't have the cars that we have today. And I would also say, I would also look to the most recent full decade, the 2010s. I wasn't following real closely what Porsche was doing with their new cars during the 2010s. And so I really had to work hard on that to try to understand all the breadth of what Porsche's been doing the past 10 or 15 years, because I just hadn't been paying that close attention to it as it was happening. And the other problem with that period of time is that you even see it in the journalism of the time is, the cars are so good that the journalists are struggling to find new ways to say best Porsche ever, best,
Mm.
911 ever. And the superlatives, I won't say it becomes boring, but the superlatives start to pile on top of each other, and it's hard to know what to really pay attention to. And um, but Porsche does what Porsche does. Every time a new car comes out, it's better. They've always
Mhm.
find ways to make it better, faster. Um, and that's an amazing thing when you think about the engineering challenge that involves.
Yeah, and I know there's some big milestones in the Porsche production world where it was kind of like, the company was on the edge, so to speak, transitioning from the 356 to the 901, which then had to be made to 911,
Mhm.
transitioning, the 993 era, like just some pretty significant hurdles they had to face from a company perspective, whether it was
Yeah.
financially, facing bankruptcy, getting bought out. Is there one that kind of stood out above the others as, like the big Herculean effort in which to survive, I guess, that you might point our readers
Hmm.
to?
Again, that is kind of a tough one. I think the obvious one is the period immediately after World War II.
Mm,
This
mhm.
is a period where the survival of the people themselves and the company was very much in doubt. And, um, it did take a Herculean effort, as you say, to just kind of find work for a core nucleus of people, and then to take the audacious step of saying, well, we're going to build our own car.
Mm.
And that's how the 356 started. And of course, at that time, there was no certainty that it would succeed. At first, they were not certain that they were going to be a manufacturer of automobiles long term. I believe it was a contract for 500 bodies from Reuter, and there was no guarantee that there would ever be more than 500 cars built.
Mm.
So,
Right.
and there's some interesting business reasons why it made sense to continue building the cars, and I do touch on that. I try to touch on the business side of the story at several points. So it's not just about the cars, it's also about the people running the business, the engineers, the designers. I like to try to introduce the readers at a very basic level to some of these people whose names you might have heard, but maybe you don't know too much about. People like Hans Metzger or Wendelin Wiedeking or Dr. Bott. Ferry Porsche himself, Ferry Porsche has been gone now for more than 25 years, I think. So a lot of the younger folks and even some of the older folks maybe don't know as much about Ferry Porsche and his sister Louise Piech, who's a very important person in the story, mostly behind the scenes. So I try to touch on all of the people and the events that went into managing the business over time. And that includes the other really challenging period, which is the early 1990s. For a variety of reasons, we know Porsche was in some significant financial difficulty, and how they got through that period of time is interesting. And again, it sort of set the stage for where we are now in some ways. They learned lean manufacturing and manufacturing efficiency from the Kaizen consultants from Japan that really were helpful. And they, again, did a number of other steps during that period, including, Boxster comes to mind, the transition to water cooling, the expansion of the market with the Cayenne. Those steps, all of those are all basic steps that took place during the 1990s that then sort of um, um, laid the groundwork for where Porsche is today as a company.
Yeah, the last time I looked at, I think it was one of the most recent PCA magazines. The number one selling Porsche was the Macan. And
Hmm.
you think about
Yeah.
the Cayenne kind of saving the company by transitioning into SUVs, and it really was the first of a tidal wave. I mean, now we have the Lamborghini Urus, we have the new Ferrari, sport
Hmm.
ute, whatever
Hmm.
the sport activity, whatever they call it, sport activity
Yeah.
vehicle. We have the Aston Martin. Everybody has theirs, but Porsche was the first. And I
Yeah.
remember, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought it was some type of quote from a Porsche executive that said, every time we look in a garage with a 911, there's someone else's sport ute there. Why can't that
Hmm.
be a Porsche sport ute, right?
Yeah. I think that was part of it. The other thing that was interesting to me in doing the research is at the time, and I'll admit I said a lot of unkind things myself about the Cayenne and the idea of Porsche building something other than a sports car, which I'm not proud of. But I admit I said some things that really don't make any sense now in thinking back on it. But what Porsche looked at was the fact that the market for SUVs was 7 times greater than the market for sports cars at that
Right.
time. So they said, if we're going to expand our business and expand our customer audience, where should we look? Well, we've got a market here that's 7 times greater than our sports car market, and I'm sure that number has probably expanded greatly since then. But I think the Cayenne. Uh, I might quibble with you on the Cayenne saving Porsche. I think Porsche was
Mm.
saved, if we're going to use that word. I think it was saved before the Cayenne. I think the Cayenne is the thing that really sort of turbocharged Porsche's growth into the future. And we've, of course, now seen it with the brand extension to four-door luxury sedan with Panamera, with the Macan for the smaller size crossover, and so on. So I think Porsche was saved before the Cayenne, but the Cayenne was a brilliant move, and those of us who are sports car guys, I think we have to recognize that without those four-door cars, Porsche might not be able to build our sports cars the way we want them. Um, so I think the four doors are great, and we'd love to see more four-door owners participate in the club and participate in the Porsche culture.
Well, you're the expert. You've written 2 books, at least 2 books. How many books have you written on Porsche?
Oh, just the two.
All right. Well, that's 2 more than me. So you're the expert when it comes to Porsche history. But it's kind of like Ferrari in the 50s. They built road cars to go racing. I mean, it wasn't like,
Yeah.
they necessarily wanted to build road cars, but everybody now looks back and really appreciates it. Obviously. Now, as you were there's a lot of different Porsche myths out there.
Uh,
One of them I like to reference is the reasoning that the ignition is on the left hand side. For years I had heard that it was because of Le Mans. They would run towards the car. You have your key out, you can put it in the ignition switch as you're jumping in the car. But then I read some articles saying that was not actually true. They actually interviewed one of the factory workers back into the
yeah.
day, and they said it
Hmm.
was to save on copper wiring. The length of the copper wire was much shorter on the left hand side. Are there some of those myths that you were able to debunk, or some new fun facts that you had no idea about Porsche during your research phase?
I don't know that I debunked any because at an introductory level, I don't know that we can get too far into the debunking process on some of the myths and legends. I certainly discussed the one you just referenced, which is the left-hand ignition position. And I did quote, that was Dan Neal's article in the Wall Street Journal several years ago, where he quoted Klaus Bischoff, who was running the museum at the time, saying that in the very first 356, that was the reason for the switch being on the left, was to save a little bit of wire.
Okay,
It's in
good.
it, yeah, that's I mean that's a real thing. It's in the literature. And it's interesting that Porsche kind of went back and forth. Some of the 356s were then built with the ignition switch in the middle of the console. We have the 550, which was the racing car that was perfect for the run and jump start. But I believe the early 550s have the ignition switch in the middle or on the right instead of on the left. So I think there may be a combination of things going on there, and it may be that at a certain point they just decided that the ergonomics were better to have the ignition switch in your left hand while you're getting ready to drive. Um, uh, other other myths, I can't really think of too many others that I really worked on as far as trying to debunk. I did find some, many what I think are interesting fun facts that are again included in those Porsche points in the book. And so hopefully people will read those and say, even the experts maybe will read it and say, hey, I didn't know that. Or, maybe I'll get some letters saying, well, no, that's not right. But hopefully we got most of them correct. And hopefully people will enjoy hearing some of those fun facts, including some about their own cars. And why did Porsche do this? Why did Porsche do that at certain points in their history?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most exciting parts about the book is exploring your own car. Because like I had a 996, and everybody knows the story on the, first liquid cool, fried
Hmm.
egg headlights, boxer suspension up front. Like a lot of those things are pretty well known, but I don't know that a lot of the stuff after that is pretty well known as far as the evolution of not only in the 911 but the Boxster and the Cayman and such. So I think that would be
Yeah,
very interesting for
yeah.
our
I think
listeners. And so many of the new Porsche fans are
mhm,
Cayman Boxster, fans, as well as the 911 fans.
absolutely. And I try to, we could, and other authors have written entire books about, pick your favorite Porsche. Nearly every one has had entire books written about it. I'm trying to give basically a brief summary of some of that development work and the changes from one generation to the next, because I usually have only one or two paragraphs to work with to, let's say, explain the transition from 996 to 997 or 997.1 to 997.2. So I'm doing that at a pretty cursory, pretty summary level. And then people, of course, can go on and get into much greater depth on that by reading other works. But I think for new Porsche Club members, new owners, much as I would like to have them read, the entire library from Mr. Ludwigsen, I don't know that that's realistic, at least not to start off with for our new Porsche Club members. So I do try to point the way to where can you find more information. My bibliography is pretty extensive in the back of the book, but it is fun and it's informing to see how Porsche, they just never stop developing and improving the cars. They're always finding new ways to make the cars better, faster, as I said, more reliable. And of course, the 996 you mentioned is an interesting one because I didn't realize. I don't think I realized until I started doing the book that the reason it's called the 996 is because it was intended originally to come out in 1996. Same with the 993, it was intended for 1993, and both of those got pushed back a bit in terms of when they actually became available to the public. So that's kind of a little fun fact. And the 996, as you know, was supposed to bring about the end of Western civilization as we know it by having a water-cooled 911 was unthinkable at the time. But I'll give you one more quick one that speaks to Porsche's culture. We talk about this often, I think, in the club, that the Porsche culture does have a curmudgeonly aspect to it, and there's a resistance to change. And I think the interesting thing is that goes back almost all the way to the beginning of Porsche as a manufacturer. The customers, there was a segment of customers that were resistant to change almost from the beginning. So, for instance, in the early 50s, when Porsche finally switched to using their own technology for the synchromesh and the gearbox, the early 356 owners resisted that, and in so many words said, "That's not a real Porsche. My grandmother could drive that."
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking 1952, 1953. There's already this resistance to change.
Right.
Happened again with the 911. So many 356 owners would say, no, the only real Porsche is a 4-cylinder, right? So that's why the 912 outsold the 911 initially, because the culture resisted the 6-cylinder. And that we talked about the Cayenne. I was guilty in that case. And and you can find this in almost every stage of the game with Porsche. You can find the hardcore fans kind of having this curmudgeonly resistance to whatever the new thing is. Water-cooled 911 is a good example also. But eventually people come around and people say, yeah, guess what? It's a better car. It's a faster car. It's more comfortable. It's whatever. The engineering solution, eventually the better engineering solution is going to prevail. And now today we see resistance to electrification, which maybe comes from a broader place, not just within the Porsche culture, but that resistance to electrification is nothing new at all in my view, as far as the Porsche folks, some of the Porsche folks being resistant to that particular idea.
Yeah. Well, in your defense, the first gen Cayenne was kind of ugly. So, in your defense,
Well,
it's gotten much better. I really like the way it looks today.
yeah, they have improved the styling. First generation Panamera also came in for some deserving criticism from a styling point of view, and there's reasons for that. But today's Panamera, I think, is a terrific looking car. If you want the sort of executive class sedan. Porsche styling is another thing I do try to touch on in the book. Fascinating that basically there's only been 5 men that have been the keeper of the flame as far as Porsche styling over the 75-year period of time. And the way that Porsche, unlike any other manufacturer, the form language, the styling language, they've been loyal to it, really basically beginning to end. Porsches are almost instantly recognizable because the designers and the stylists have stayed true to that form language that goes all the way back to the beginning. And even further goes back to the 1930s with the Volkswagen and with the Berlin to Rome car, the 60K10. Um, so that is a really interesting piece of Porsche history, because even Ferrari, I'm not sure that Ferrari has been as consistent to their particular design language as Porsche has been. I think Ferrari's been willing to try and go down some different alleys and some different directions over time, whereas Porsche has been pretty consistent, really for that whole 75-year period, at least from what I can see.
Right, right. Okay. Well, I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
But before I get to that, what's the best way for our listeners to find your book and as well as your Porsche 917 book?
Well, we have a few copies of the Golf 917 book left, not that many. It's done reasonably well over the past 5.5 years, and both books are available ideally from the publisher, Dalton Watson. So it's www.daltonwatson.com. Daltonwatson.com is where to find the book, and I hope people will enjoy it and get something out of it. And I hope that it will help them join in the conversation, especially when people like you and me, Greg, we start throwing those numbers around, right? 993, 718,
Right.
910, 908.
Yep.
The newer people very quickly can get lost when we start, because you and I know what we're talking about, but the newer people sometimes very quickly get lost when we start throwing those numbers around. So if nothing else, I hope the book will be a good orientation to what these mysterious 3-digit numbers. Some of them, of course, are 2-digit numbers as well. We saw a 2-digit number at Goodwood this past weekend. I don't know if you saw Audi's recreation
I did
of the.
not. I did not.
Yeah, well, Audi had commissioned basically a what if. They have
Mm.
commissioned the Type 52. So that's a Porsche type number 52, which was a design for an Auto Union supercar, a supercar based on the Auto Union Grand Prix car in the 1930s. And it's pretty cool because we've only ever seen drawings
Wow.
that the Porsche design office did for this proposal that never was built. And now we can see it in the flesh, so to speak. We can see the Type 52, what it potentially would have been had they built it um, in the 1930s. But again, it's just a project number, right? It's 52, happens to be the project number for that particular car, just like 356 and 910 and 908 and all the other 928, all the other numbers that we throw around, as
It's
second nature.
it's funny because I am not an expert in Porsches, and I'll be like, all right, 991 came after 997. Like I got to do the math in my head.
Oh, yeah.
They're not sequential.
Well, really
Well,
quick, I'll give you a really
yeah,
quick story on that. I was there at Rennsport when they took the sheets off the 991 for the first time. And this was back in 2012. And I remember the Porsche guys, they were so proud of their new baby, this, fantastic new 911. And again, there was a lot of questions from the curmudgeonly side of the Porsche culture asking the engineers, why did we go backwards on the number from 997 to 991? And of course, the Porsche engineers were like, who cares? That doesn't mean anything. Why aren't you asking me about this fantastic new car that we've just, that we're trying to launch here? So it
well,
was
it's
kind
funny
of fun.
because you think about it. We've got what 7 more generations before we got to go backwards even further, right?
Yeah. Well,
Nine
Porsches
nine. Well,
are,
no, we have less. We only have like a
well,
handful. Nine nine
yeah,
four, 995,
yeah.
nine nine
They're
eight.
already recycling the numbers though, right? Because
Yeah,
numbers like 918 and 919 and 718, right? The
yeah.
718 Boxer. So Porsche's having to recycle some of those numbers for marketing purposes, and that's fine. I I personally don't have any problem with it as long as the cars are good.
All right, my second to last question.
Yeah.
Do you know what their super secret hypercar coming out is? Is it a hybrid 917 or something crazy? All right.
I have no idea. I mean, I think you would assume the Mission X would be the basis for something if they're going to do something. but I have no inside information, no real insight to that. I think it is cool that the Mission X has the 917 roof window on it. A few people pointed that out. That was a nice little styling cue from Porsche's history.
Yeah, and I've heard there's some big announcement coming at the Quell here in a couple weeks, so we'll see if
Okay,
that's
well, we'll
indeed
see.
true
I
or
mean,
not.
I mean, there would be logic to Porsche doing a pure EV supercar. I think the logic of that is pretty obvious, if assuming there's a market for it. But I have no inside information and no real guesswork on that.
Well, my last question for you is, ironically, I was for another podcast interview. I was on the Revs Institute website today, grabbing some screenshots,
Mhm.
and just the depth of their Porsche collection is actually pretty astounding. And I noticed
Yeah.
that Miles did your introduction. So,
hmm
how did that come about? Was were you like, all right, I'm just going to get one of the biggest, best Porsche collectors in the world? How did that happen?
Um, I have tremendous respect for Mr. Collier. I think that he's an excellent writer. He's one of the best communicators I think that we have. And I would say to your audience, if you ever have a chance to hear him speak, say at Pebble Beach or some other forum, don't miss that opportunity. He really, in terms of the collector car world, he understands it so well, and he can articulate it better than almost anybody I can think of. So I thought that, and also we know he's a tremendous Porsche enthusiast. I think close to half, or maybe more than half of the collection are Porsches. And so he has deep knowledge and experience with Porsche. So when you put all that together, I thought he would be great for the doing the forward. I had a brief conversation with him at Rensport last year and mentioned what I was doing with the project, and he said, yeah, let me know when it's finished. I'll take a look at it. And so it was really nice of him to do the forward for me. Greatly appreciative of that. And of course, Revs, we used photos from the library for my first book. We used quite a nice little selection of photos from their amazing library in my first book.
Right. Yeah. Just astounding for sure. So,
Yeah.
well, Jay, as always, thank you for being on the Collector Car podcast. When can we expect your next book?
I don't know. I do have an idea for one. I'm not really ready to talk about it, but there is an idea for one that I'm starting to fool around with a little bit. So stay tuned for that maybe a couple of years from now. And I hope that one other thing that maybe Porsche Decades can do for you, Greg, and for your clients is if you have clients that are collectors that haven't put a toe in the Porsche water yet, maybe the book can be educational and helpful for them when they decide, hey, it's time to add a Porsche to my collection.
Yeah.
I think it will help put the cars in context and give new collectors who are new to Porsche maybe get some perspective on Porsche from the book. Again, at an introductory level, and they can say, yeah, I should have a classic 911, or I should have a classic Porsche racing car in my collection. How does that all fit together?
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Jay, as always, thanks for being on the Collector Car podcast. I appreciate it, buddy.
Okay, Greg, it's good to see you.